Esse, Delendam, and we're going to discuss the role of the public intellectual in general. So we're just going to see where it goes. So Esse, do you want to say anything to begin?
Yeah, so I'm very glad to be back on the in Agon, and yeah, so Terence McKenna has said something about 20 years ago or so that he thinks the internet is a possible portal to the omega point, as he puts it, and that it's a physical analog to psychedelics. And so, however that may be, nonetheless, I think he gives the argument that print media is dead, and that being addressed as one of a million people reading a New York Times article isn't the thing for the future, and therefore communications like this, where we can try to do what Heidegger says, going to the matter itself, not dusting on sick, but uses the phrase selves saka, the self thing, the matter itself is perhaps something we can cultivate for ourselves as a goal. And Heidegger says the only authority should be the matter itself, rather than Aristotle or anything, but seeing the thing, being led to it, being having a methodos or a path, a vague WEG. We talked about Heidegger's past to the matters is something maybe we can start sort of cultivating a demand for, or in Strauss puts it in terms of a prejudice towards a new kind of approach to these things. So anyway, I hope we could maybe achieve something in this discussion.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I like that. Different path or different frame to look at this stuff from. Yeah, because I kind of wanted to talk about the media and the changes in the media, as the platform and the medium through which the public intellectual operates in. But I don't know. Do you want to start with the media, or do you want to start in more?
So, I mean, if we start like in a good Jesuit treatment, I want to make a little statement of what we mean by both the term public and intellectual, just historically. So in Habermas's work from the 60s, from prior to the internet, but they were talking about the history of these concepts with which we see things. The structure and transformation of the public sphere, I think it's called. He remarks that we get these terms public and private in sort of Latin, cloaked in these Latin terms, but they come out of ultimately out of a Greek context. So that originally, especially in Athens, the division was between the oikos, or the household, and the public, and the polis as a whole. So we could see the beginnings of the demand of philosophy for unity in the polis already, as it was long prior to Plato, or let's say for a couple hundred years prior to Plato, in the especially in the theater. So like in the shadow of the Acropolis, which is the most holy site in Athens, there was an amphitheater, and there's divided into 10 sections of seating, which were meant for each of the, they call them phylii. That's sort of related to the Latin word phylum, taxonomic division, but it was really phylii, like in affiliation. Is really meant that the demes, like Socrates was from a specific deme, which was a deme where the stonemasons primarily lived. His father and himself and stonemasons, statue makers. A collection of demes comes together in forms of a phylii, and then each of these collections had a specific seating place in the theater. So the theater was understood as under the theoi of Dionysus, not Dionysius, tyrant, or the pseudo Areopagite, but Dionysus. There's an extra letter in the name person. The name of the god is one less letter. Dionysus is the god of ecstasis, which means standing, which is what an actor does, stand out from themselves and show something else. And also this word stasis, one may have heard in the course of there's philosophical readings. This has something to do with a rebellion. So it's like, apparently the idea is sometimes people would stand up in a group, and their standing together was kind of like what the American founders call a faction. And this was a kind of rebellion against the whole. When those plays were carried out originally, or performed, they weren't really just plays. Actually, there was music, and the people we call playwrights, like Aeschylus or Sophocles, were just playwrights. They were writing music and choreographing dance, because orchestra really means the dancing place. And it was, I think the atmosphere was basically like that of a courtroom today, comparable to that. It was very quiet. They say you could hear a pin drop, and you'd sit there all day watching plays, and the plays would show like moral issues. So I think there's an analogy, and I know everybody talks about Antigone, but it's convenient because it's clear what the theme was and why the play was liked. It was an anti-Theban play, so not Thebes in Egypt, but Thebes. That's like a little bit, I guess, like west, like a little bit northwest of Athens, but very close to Athens. So there's this constant theme in those plays of like anti-Thebianness and putting Thebes forward as gangsters and as basically here's Creon, who's kind of like involved in his blood feuds and his vendettas and his vicious behavior and so on. And Putin has this guy Navalny sort of buried away in the prison system, not killing him. But it's a Creon that's killed the guy that spoke out against him, the brother of Antigone, but not buried him. But it's kind of like there's an analogy with the way this public presentation, which is supposed to bring all the administrative, all the people of Athens together to see this, and then to bring it to publicness, which is Habermas uses this nice formula. He says it's representation and existence are about the same thing. So to bring something to publicness, to bring it to the polis, to bring it to representation, to bring it to existence. So everybody now knows about it. It becomes a public thing. And then we see, oh, here's what the wicked Thebans are doing. I feel like that it has a nice analogy in the origin of this split with the current the collective West version of Putin, right? Like Putin is this wicked gangster, and so on. There may be some truth to it, but it's very similar. And let me say one more thing: is that Aristotle says that the despot is the head of the household is the despot. The head of the oikos household is the despot. And Plato said exactly the same thing Plato is saying in the nomoi, in the laws. There's a hierophany of the laws, so of the law becomes like a person. This person of the laws is a despot. So basically the distinction in Plato and Socrates of the nomoi or laws is the despotic private thing. Because originally the laws, in fact, were the sole domain of people like Creon, who were just in their household and kind of made up things as they went along. And then the laws became public, and then you got the public sphere where people had to discuss what the laws were, and it was known after Draco, after about 600, and then Plato's relative Solon kind of modified them. But if you look at the nomoi, you see what they're vying against, or what they consider so invidious, or this polemic with Thebes includes the different way of, includes the fact that the Thebans didn't make the division between public and private. And in the nomoi, it's like three. The Athenian stranger is probably basically just a version. Let's pretend Socrates didn't take the hemlock, but instead ran off to Crete, which was Lacedaemonian, or what's that word we were talking about before? That they use it in terms of the pillars, the three kinds of pillars. The simplest. Anyway, Spartan, Lacedaemonian, or my memory is failing here. But do you know there's three kinds of pillars of Greek pillars? There's like the simple, the Dorian. Sorry, the Dorian
Dorians, the
pillar.
Ionians, and
Yeah,
so isn't it Dorians, Ionians, and
yeah,
whatever the
and
Athenians are? Yeah.
well, the Athenians are the Ionians, and
Okay.
then the ones that are supposed to be more complex are the Corinthians. So the Dorian goes with Spartan and with Lacedaemonian, which relates to our word laconic, like not speaking that much. But the idea is that on Crete, um, these Dorians or Spartans, like there's the ones, Paulus is Sparta, right? But then Sparta is also a larger domain and includes kind of an ethnic type, which is either like Dorian or Lacedaemonian. So it's kind of like there's this overlapping um, ways of characterizing it. But anyway, in Crete is basically the same culture as Sparta, and they don't allow for public discussion of the laws. So they're pre-public private split. And the idea is that only the very old men, like Socrates was pictured. They don't say Socrates, it's an Athenian stranger, is talking to these two old men about modifying the laws. And so that's like, from the Greek point of view, that's the oikos private thing. And the despot, as Aristotle says, the despotic thing, the laws are despotic. And then there's this other thing which corresponds to the politeia, or the um, Plato's Republic, as we call it. And that's more like what's going on in the theater, where you're seeing the ecstasis, the actors showing you what roles people could, like in the Assembly of Women, there's a thing where show that the women could run the city, for instance. This is possibilities of roles for different Athenians, how we could run the city, right? And that's what's also going on in Plato's Republic. So this split, the split between, just to reiterate, the split between public and private goes for Athens, but it didn't go for the enemies of Athens, who they're deliberately have this polemic against. And a lot of the plays that they're showing in their Greek theaters are about that.
Okay, cool. That's some interesting backgrounds into ancient Greece there. Yeah, because I was aware of oikos through that being the original word of economics. So yeah, I was aware
And
of
also, there's something called the O Economicus, an ancient text about how to run it. It's basically about how to run a plantation. It's totally different from. That's why I say that Hobbes' student, William Petty, is the first modern economist. He called what he was doing political arithmetic. So the point is that the political sphere is the public sphere, whereas oikos was originally said in contradistinction between the public, between the political economy or political arithmetic. And so modern economics is like a kind of an oxymoron from the point of view of the Greeks, or it's some kind of paradox.
Well, I was going to say that like the modern economy seems to be, like an economic central economy. If you think about people like Margaret Thatcher, who would say, let's run Britain like it's a household. Like she is this kind of completely
Right? Yeah,
private
yeah.
understanding of,
And the household is the
country.
despotic, cited the despotism, according
Yeah.
to Aristotle.
So like you have this emergence of this distinction between the oikos and the polis, the private and the public, and then that's kind of cultivated within European history since the Athenians. And then I do feel like modern capitalism has somehow tried to kind of reverse that or something. And you even
Yeah,
see
it's
this.
very complicated because it's like
Yeah.
What Habermas is talking about in his book is like all these gradations, but what he's saying is like the de facto situation was always changing historically, but then this concept has been haunting the collective West, to use the Putin word, or Dugin and Putin's word, for all this time, even though it doesn't exactly, it's taken from the Greek world and then it was taken over by the Romans, and it's used conceptually in the law, especially in the Roman law, but it doesn't necessarily, even historically, didn't necessarily fit the reality all those 2,000 years.
Mm. Well, this is probably too early in the discussion to bring this up, but this does kind of then lead you into the role of experts, because experts are like these household managers, but they're like public officials and household managers at the same time. They're kind of like non-political, private individuals that run everything, are supposed to run everything in this perfect
Right.
way,
I
if
mean,
you
I
get me.
think that's already visible in Plato very explicitly and clearly, a theme of Plato or of Socrates, that yeah, if there was really a guy that knew how to run things. Sometimes there were by talent somebody that's good at running a city, like Themistocles or somebody. But the question is like whether it can be reliably taught, and so that we could always reliably have somebody that's good. Maybe Putin's good, maybe he's not. He seems very like a treacherous guy to me in a lot of ways, but maybe he's good for running, relatively good for running Russia, just like President Xi, maybe relatively good for running China. But the question is that just at the loss of talent? I think like recently when I was looking at this stuff with Netanyahu's citing this thing called Amalek, they mentioned many times in the Hebrew Bible, there's instances where there's a guy like the prophet Samuel, who everybody admits is just and does things pretty well. And then he has kids who he raises properly, teaches properly, they're well informed, but they're just corrupt, bad people. So we're at this idea that we're just at the mercy of things that can't be strictly instilled in the next leader is I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's known totally throughout the tradition, but the problem of experts um, in an age of so many fields and so many and of technology, I think is a bit different, because they're just talking about experts in terms of like a good ruler of Athens or something, or a few things.
Yeah, I think, like, see, this is always the problem with the idea of expertise, because for Plato, this sort of means um, a public political ruler, whereas expert in the modern context means someone from a certain skill or a certain industry that can manage things in order
But
to
also,
indefinitely grow the economy or something like that, right? This is like a completely different understanding of
right.
the expert. Yeah.
I mean, public economy wasn't an issue even I mean, even until the 18th. Yeah, I mean, one is William Petty. That's like, so Hobbes is like 17th century. It's like, yeah, it's really not until, uh, I don't know, like approach, past 1700 that this was really a big deal, because before that you had the guilds, and the guilds provided basically everything. There's, 100 different medieval guilds or medieval corporation, and they provided the permanent needs like candles, bedstands, chairs, cabinets, whatever was generally needed. But then we have such a ramification of demands, like, cell phones and all kinds of things that never existed before, becoming and copy machines and all kinds, endless things. So it's virtually scale basically.
Yeah. But so I'm reading some of Plato's dialogues at the moment, for kind of research project reasons. And um you'll notice a few dialogues like Charmides, they'll have this very detailed discussion over what we would call expertise, right? In the modern context. So he'll say like Socrates will ask, Charmides or Critias or whoever, does expert knowledge in, shipbuilding give you wisdom? And I suppose no, it gives you a particular kind of knowledge, but it's not a what we might call a political or a philosophic knowledge in the proper sense of wisdom. And then particularly in Charmides, you then have Critias,
It's empiric, I think, is the way they think about it.
But like you also have in Charmides,
it doesn't require like discussion. It's like you could learn shipbuilding just from watching somebody. Is the way they think about it.
That isn't made explicit.
Like a shoemaker too.
But I suppose that's implied. It's not explicit in the dialogue, but
well, I mean, because not only in the they don't only discuss that in Charmides, but in other dialogues.
Yeah.
I think in the Charmides, don't they talk about the necessity for an example, and like for the example of an example with the weaving, something about weaving?
It's called the science of science. So like Critias thinks that like Critias actually understands that the particular shipbuilder doesn't have wisdom, but he seems to take it in the complete other direction and say only wisdom is like not a science of a particular practice. So like what is the science of naval voyaging? It's like navigation or something like that. What is the kind of science of war? It's aimed at battle, at winning battle. What is the science of whatever? And Critias kind of goes, no, like wisdom is science of science. Like it's just like knowledge of knowledge, and it's knowing if you do or do not have knowledge. And then Socrates, which he normally argues in this way, but in this dialogue, Socrates pushes back and goes, I just don't know if you can have a knowledge if it's not basically embodied in some sort of telos or some sort of end, like an actual end within the world, So you have this really interesting discussion over.
Yeah, kind of comes to what everybody calls metaphysics. If you get into problems that are very arid, almost arid.
But the interesting thing about this dialogue is that Socrates almost comes off as kind of being almost anti-metaphysical. He's just deeply suspicious that you can have a science.
Because he's the phronimos. He's the phronimos. I mean, they have in the Catholic tradition, when you get to this type of question, they talk about like judicium prudentis viri, who is, they say there's certain situations where pure intellectual understanding can't quite get you there. So like, for instance, in this discussion with Putin, I kind of feel like I can make a lot of analysis, but then there's some things that are still clouded. I can't quite tell what's going on. And then they say, what you do there, the Catholics say, like what you should do there is look for somebody who's not clouded too much by passions, and bring in this so-called prudential man, this phronimos, and which Socrates is probably the original archetype, and ask him what he thinks, and that's the best you can do. It's like but it's considered less than pure intellectual certitude about a matter.
Yeah. So I wrote down there we kind of got like a pattern of distinctions. So you got like oikos and polos. You've got what you might call technical knowledge and like political or philosophic knowledge, and then you've got private public.
Well, I don't think the oikos, like the head of the household, isn't. Yeah, okay. So that's but those aren't exactly together. Yeah, there's technical, and then there's. I don't know. The distinction between technical knowledge and other knowledge isn't necessarily. Yeah, the Greeks have the idea of techne. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same, because they also have the idea of the empiric, like a doctor that just tries things out but doesn't have necessarily a theoretical proof. I think I don't know if a shoemaker.
Here's another example, right? you you have knowledge gained through experience of activity, but people don't sort of understand the principles in a rational sense of what they're doing. They don't really
Yeah,
understand
yeah,
the,
yeah.
and then you have knowledge which you can understand the principles of, but if you don't embody that in some sort of practice or activity, is it really knowledge? And I think that's
Yeah, it doesn't have
basically,
an ergon, doesn't have a work or an opera, something that operates. Once you like a shoe
yeah,
is ergon. It's operate is it's inertia according to Aristotle. It's the actual thing that's been produced by that art.
because this is the exact distinction which is made in Lashes with Nicias and Lashes, because Lashes is like, the kind of more like hardened, gritty soldier, and he's got experience of battle, and he kind of uses his instinct, but he doesn't really know how to articulate the principles of something. And then you have Nicias, who's kind of more rational and articulates the principles of things, but he thinks you can just apply these principles to any situation. And Lashes is
Yeah,
like,
that's
no, you
fun.
can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's fine. I was just thinking when you're saying that that mathematician Ramanujan or whatever his name is, the Indian guy that like gives some intuitional sense of what he was doing mathematically, but then supposedly when he got to uh, Oxford or wherever he went, they told him, "Well, you're not giving the proofs in the way it's not rigorous enough in the way we want it. We want you to be able to prove these things rather than just make these leaps, even though you understand it."
Mm. Yeah, like there seems to be a division between like rationality and intuition there, which is like, which I think Plato is trying to synthesize maybe, or something like that. And like you kind of wonder if, okay, so like just to bring it back into the topic of the public intellectual, because again, in like a modern context, we might talk about generalists versus specialists. So the public intellectual would have to be a generalist. Like you don't really have public intellectuals that are technical experts in an industry. It wouldn't make
Yeah, I
sense.
think the big thing, the big watershed. See, for us, it's very complicated because yeah, the polis all gathered in that theater, like a courtroom, is a totally different situation than what's arisen out of the rise of civil society and like around 1800, where you had both coffee houses and salons where discussion chatter was happening constantly, and the rise of the critic, like actually, I think a good example is like 1700. So like Strauss uses this example is Jonathan Swift's The Battle of the Books, where his like he's analogizing a pen to like a war engine, and the ink going to the books that are in the library of the king, where the ancient authors are warring with the modern authors over. I mean, why we care about ideas could be stated very simply because the king has some ideas and he acts on them, and people presumably sometimes act on ideas. Often that doesn't happen because political necessity uh, forces a politician just to be a politician rather than a statesman and just to go along with the political thing. But sometimes people act on ideas, and even according to Kant, everybody is always acting on an idea, but they just don't spell it out. That's what he calls the maxims. But our situation is different in that it's like a market. There's not up until like the rise of these coffee. I think it's like Habermas gives some statistics on like when there were like no coffee houses in London, and then like I think by 1700 there's like 3,000 coffee houses or something. I can't remember the exact dates, but it's like once you have this chattering class and they're talking about issues of political moment, then you no longer have like like courtroom situation, like when those plays are being performed in Athens, or the situation where um, Catholic clergy is saying this is what we think is the right thing, and they have like Dugan that their ability to mix with the people and kind of explain their theological opinions in a way that's they can transmit to ordinary people. and they're like skilled at that from thousands of years of practice of doing that. Suddenly you have this situation of a marketplace of like, there's some book comes out, people are discussing it in a salon, um, uh, and like there's some critics say, I think it's good, it's bad, but ultimately they don't have any authority. And then the situation where the king and his minister are the most important thing gradually gets encroached upon by the public sphere. And like by 1870, it's just like totally 1880, I think, when Ernst Renan came out with his essay on like what is a nation, and he said the nation is the daily plebiscite. By that time, it was obvious that you couldn't ignore, totally obvious even to the stupidest person. It was totally obvious that the king could not ignore what came to be called public opinion. And in fact, it didn't even have a name in Germany for the longest time. They call it Offentlichkeit, which is often means openness somehow. But it was like these things were received at different times in first in England or Britain, first in Britain, and then like in France, and I think then in Germany. So there's like a sort of the time frames are different somehow of the Dawson of those different people in a way that Heidegger is very aware of. But yeah, basically public. We can't think of public in the same way as it was in the Greek world, because it's more like the marketplace since about at least since 1800. Marketplace of ideas, blah blah blah.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So the idea of the public changed
Anyways,
in modernity in a radical way, and it hasn't really been stated how, like not just here but in general, like.
and also let me say it this way: if we do the historical version, we do the version I just did or something like it. But if we just start from ourselves, then we ask, what do people mean by public intellectuals? What are they? What's all the talk about public intellectuals? And we just start there instead of with the etymology and the history, and then we get a different result. But that's more like the Wittgenstein Sprachspiel result. Like, what are people using this word to mean?
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, the you mentioned because you mentioned this, kind of cafe culture, intelligentsia class. It does seem like we live in a time where the public intellectual has become its own version of private, because it's kind of detached itself from what Hume or someone would call common life, right? It's detached itself from the society it's in. It's become, and not just in the technical expert mode, but even more in the humanities mode, right? It's become a kind of profession of thinkers rather than people that are somehow thinking from within inside their particular historical situation and community. Would that be like a fair critique?
Yeah, and I think but I think the big thing is there's a publicness or representation or existence of certain terms, certain discussion. And this is what people are always talking about when they say, oh, the media is biased or something, or the media is leading us this way or that way. And then McKenna put it, is talking about the internet and being any-to-any communication rather than sort of communication from the top of the kind of the pyramid hanging up unsupported or supported by like pikes or something, like the top part of the pyramid where you're getting beamed down. Here's the way you can discuss things. These are the terms that are in currency, and this is what exists for public discussion. Like just a while ago, it was probably for public discussion, it was much harder to break in with anything in favor of Putin, because people would say, oh, Putin has like a small mustache, he's Hitler, et cetera, et cetera. That was the general opinion. But like just in, recently more and more we're getting aired Jeffrey Sachs version and Mersheimer's version and this recent Tucker Carlson interview, and you see kind of more Russian version of what what they're thinking, and then that becomes represented. It exists, and then the sphere of the views that exist and everybody can talk about is still narrow, but it changes in its content.
Yeah.
And then there's everyone else in the cafes or whatever with all their idiosyncratic imbecilism and everything like that. And but they're all like in the light of that publicity or existence.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, so you have the change in the because I was going to write something about this with the Putin Tucker Carlson interview, which was that you have this change in the 20th century mode of broadcasting and the internet, where it's like the 20th century mode is like short, kind of easily controlled and quite easy to edit, and more owned, like the actual content, the product of the media itself, the video or the audio is owned by a smaller group of people. You have a kind of public relations mode, which comes out of that from like Edward Bernays and Lippmann and people, these kind of experts of communication. How do you communicate to the public or mediate between two different groups, And they have this public relations capacity where it's like you don't need to be coherent and like legitimately coherent and have like a well thought out argument and a well thought out justification or account of anything. You just need to have a kind of perception management, which will give
and advertising techniques.
advertising technique, an aura of authority will be and reassurance or maybe panic, depending on the context, will be given out to the people, and that will kind of shepherd them. And I think what you see what happening when people, like, for example, the Putin interview, is like there's now the kind of politicians and leaders that are actually sitting down for 2 hours and having a kind of relatively unedited discussion. And that's a big change, because it's going to make the PR the PR dependent rulers, it's basically going to, like, it's going to make them look stupid.
Well, I mean, it depends on how good an impression Putin makes. So, like, I mean, to me, I think Putin is, he's a treacherous guy. I don't know totally. Like, I think he has the ability to. I mean, I think the Russians and Dugin have a point, but I think also Putin is a treacherous man, individual. I'm not saying he's bad or he's bad for the Russians, but I just think he has the ability to say things that seem like they're sincere, but he could be lying. So it's kind of like, I think of the case of in Othello, Iago, because like usually if somebody in Iago told Othello, like Desdemona is cheating on you or something like that. Usually if somebody's in real life, like if something like that happens, a lot of times you don't really trust the person that tells you something like that. But there's certain people like Putin who have the ability to seem sincere. I think of the example of, there's this movie with Colin Farrell, I think his name is, with the Banshees of Inisherin or something like that, where he plays this character who's everybody's telling him like he's stupid, and he keeps insisting, "Oh no, I'm smarter than the rest of you." And then he gets like to this breaking, but everybody thinks he's good-hearted and he's like sincere. But he gets to this breaking point where he starts misusing his ability to be sincere to lie to people. And I think Putin has that. So I don't know how much Putin is orchestrating this discussion. And there's a number of things that were very suspicious to me, especially his mention is kind of Christopher Bolus, the psychoanalyst, calls it extractive interject. It's where you kind of like Putin keeps kind of slyly, while making these little saving clauses, insist kind of suggesting that Carlson is a CIA agent. Like,
yeah,
he said that, and is
weird.
Like, he makes some little backsliding comments like, "Oh, but I know I'm just saying you, but I really mean the U.S. And oh, I know you're like, oh, you tried out for the CIA, but you didn't go into it or whatever." And then there's a lot of things like that that were very seemed to me very manipulative or potentially manipulative.
Yeah, I thought maybe you could explain that by him trying to also show like the Russian public that are going to view that he's in Russia and I'm going to show him his boss is a bit of kind of putting him in his place kind of thing. I don't know. It like
Yeah, maybe.
but
It was nuanced, the whole thing. I couldn't, I'm not
it
sure.
was
It's
peculiar.
not clear.
It was a peculiar moment. But I do think even if you take in an American example, RFK, who's got this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the areas of interest that he has, and like Putin kind of has this encyclopedic knowledge of history, and like there's no doubt that you're right about him, and that he's being manipulative and treacherous. I wouldn't trust him, but there is this kind of like change in the kind of mode of public speaking, which I think podcasting and like this kind of thing, long form dialogues have created, where it's like if you want to actually engage in this new mode of media, you have to at least have read things. Like you have to at least have sat down and read things and remembered them, and at least it may be ideological and so on, but at least has to be somewhat
Well, I feel bad
internally
whenever I
coherent.
hear that just because a lot of people don't have time to do that. Like,
It's fair, but if you're
there's so many things that you have to know, and it's like there's just not time in the day for most people to get all booked up on.
well, yeah, okay, for your ordinary person, yeah, but if you're going to be like if you're going to be a ruler,
Interviewer, and that's your profession. Yeah.
If you're going to engage
You're
with
going
the
to
public
interview
sphere,
Putin. You should be, yeah. Oh,
well,
I see. For the public intellectual
yeah.
themselves, yeah.
I don't mean Tucker Carlson, because I don't expect him to know all this stuff, but like I mean basically, like, for example, if you're a politician and you're vying for power and you're just getting briefings of the issues and you're just reading the briefings and you're going, that's the way it's supposed to be, let's just do this, like you're playing a political social game. You're not thinking about the issues, you're thinking about
Here's my talking points in case the press asks me about
exactly.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what that interview does show is that there's a kind of emergence. And I think it's going to continue. I think, younger people from younger generations who are listening to podcasts,
A greater demand for, for more substantial
substantial
content in that
addressing.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that sense. Yeah. And also, I thought we saw more of Putin's personality than we usually do in that long form. Again, on the same thing as like when he was talking about the what do you call that pipeline? The
Nord Stream.
Nord Stream 2.
Yeah.
Because like he said directly is like he's like, what happened, like as though Carlson was a CIA guy, which is plausible in a way. Like I think it's not totally implausible, and so he's just like, what happened, because you're the guys that did it. So it was like, that was either it's like projection, it's like this psychological technique, or it's kind of like he's so paranoid, he kind of suspects it's true, and it's also kind of plausible. Because I think of like Bill Buckley, on Fireling Line, who's similar as a talk show host as Carlson. Bill Buckley was in the CIA when he was young. Conspiracy theory people say like, oh, once you're in the CIA, you're always in the CIA. I don't really think that's that credible, but it's like Bill Buckley was a CIA agent when he was young, and then he became a Fireling Line host and got involved with Reagan and all this stuff. And Carlson is somewhat similar as like an old patriotic kind of cast about him, like a Boston Brahmin type of cast about him, in an age where Boston Brahmins have been superseded by Kristen Stewart and by celebrities who have more power in the public sphere than do the old aristocratic class. But still, Carlson kind of reminds me of that old kind of political class who lives their whole life for political obligation in a way, and political involvement.
Yeah, but it's just that the
I mean, I wouldn't underestimate Carlson. That's all. Well, the one I'm kind of saying. Tucker Carlson isn't such a so lightweight as he kind of seems, I think. some extent.
No, I think he's probably a pretty intelligent guy, and I mean, I applaud him for doing the interview, because I mean, as a risk. I mean, you're going into Russia, you don't really know what could happen, and
Well, that too, yeah, it's pretty
yeah,
gutsy.
and also it's difficult to interview someone like Putin in general, but it's difficult to interview him in Russia in the context, because he's trying to get information out of him. He's trying to make a good interview, but he's also trying not to piss him off so much that he just fucking arrests him or something.
And also, there's such a minefield. There's such a minefield because he can't help but seem to be kind of self-consciously manipulating things. Like, oh, he smiles at the beginning of the interview to signal he's going to be tough with Putin instead of give in to, anything Putin says, and he gives that little, the little introduction where he's kind of saying, "Oh, Putin was saying some boring things at the beginning, but maybe he's sincere," and so on, and everything point of it seems questionable, but yet it's kind of like, how can he avoid that? It's like the whole thing is kind of full with some doubts about what is actually going on. I mean,
yeah. I suppose like the only thing I was taking away from there was just that the changes in media have basically made it possible, and also through the fact that you don't have a small set of corporations owning all the media anymore. You have, okay, I know technically the internet is owned by a small set of corporations, but like if we do this conversation and I save the recording onto my computer, it's mine. Like, you know what I mean? It's not Google's, it's not
yeah, but I
Microsoft.
mean, YouTube could prevent the
Of course, yeah.
promulgation of it, right? Like, and like Dugan's right, and like X, Elon Musk has given like a little bit of breath of freedom with X because it was getting like even worse than YouTube in its censorship.
Yeah, no, yeah, no, there's definitely a lot to be critiqued about the platforms themselves, but purely on a kind of technological level, the capacity for random people across the world without needing a lot of resources to just have these long format conversations. I think that has really disturbed the kind of public relations dependent elites in every country, not just in the West, but in all these other countries.
Yeah, we're in a world conversation, and there's no way to dam the dike. There's water's coming out all over the place, I think.
And like I think,
but it's not clear what that would lead to, and because like of this factor that sites like Twitter, X, and YouTube, and some other sites in this Habermas sense control what exists, because whatever can be discussed readily and publicly, like what's all the talk about the Nord Stream, or what's all the talk about the invasion of Gaza or something, that things can be readily discussed, and there's terms that are readily just already there that everybody gloms onto and everybody forms their opinions about. It reminds me of the introduction of these ideas through the the Antigone to the Greek public, so that the demand, in this sense, it's philosophical in the sense that the polis, or the public place, is this place where the philosophers are trying to achieve unity, that everything being rolled into one. And Heidegger says the demand of philosophy can be understood two ways. One, what does philosophy require? And the other, what do people want from philosophy? And the answer in both cases is a kind of unity.
Yeah. Well,
and this is like
that fits the general theme I was discussing earlier with the so this reoccurring theme in so many of Plato's texts, where you have this discussion of knowledge, but like particular knowledge directed at particular practices, and then basically a philosophic knowledge is something like an understanding of the whole, or of the interrelation between all these parts, and how they work together, and like that is basically, and also other forms of unity, like the unity of theory and practice, or the unity of your words and your actions, those kinds of things.
Ultimately, how to take decisions. I mean, how to take decisions that are affecting the whole world. If we want to be well informed, and the discussion could inform us well, but it's not clear what to take back from a discussion like the Putin Tucker discussion, and how to how it ought to, regulate our actions going forward. Because that's the point of ideas, is that the humans act, and actions are facts of history. Human actions are facts of history. That's why the notion of fact is so um, uh, uh, problematic, because it's really just based. It's really it totally involves ideas and what people's certitude about various, like what to take from an interview like that, how to understand Putin and other things like this.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I did like about that interview was that it did give me a chance to sort of properly address, like, not to a full extent, because you're never going to know, because he's not going to tell you everything. He could be misleading you, and so on and so on. But it kind of does give you an insight into it, even if it's propagandistic. It does give you an insight into the intentions and the kind of framework of options that Russia is operating under. So for example,
And
one
we
thing
kind of get
is,
to know him. We kind of get to know him as a man and a leader in a way.
yeah, I mean,
Just by spending time with somebody, you get a sense of like what they're like.
I've never seen a 2 hour interview with like Tony Blair, or George Bush. It would be unimaginable. It would, like, these people like to remain these
Well, I
very,
mean, it used to be that there were these little, like, I think of Nixon and Khrushchev, they had these
yeah,
little discussions, and then they'd be like, oh, okay, let's, how can we work this out? And even Kennedy, like, I forget what year it was. In 1963, Kennedy gave this speech on the peace speech, and he said, listen, we can't have this Pax Americana, which is the thing that kept, were already leading up to at that time. According to this political scientist, Richard Sakwa, who was on that Gaggle show, is saying like already in the 50s, this course of action, which we're only thinking about now, is starting in like 97, when the tranches of NATO expansion were like stepping on the toes of the Russians, and then the Russians said, okay, they're going to keep expanding NATO, we have to rearm and blah blah blah. But it was already happening in the 50s, because it was like there was already a decision was taken, according to Sakawa, that listen, these are the losers, and including France, and basically including Russia, and they need to subordinate themselves to America. And there, Sakawa uses this term, what was he had some nice term for it. It's like the emeritus powers or something. There's like they have a place of honor, but there's like basically subordinates, and this is how American policy has since already in the 50s has basically seen France, England, Germany, Japan, and also Russia. Like you've got to fall in line, and it goes all the way back to World War II. Even though we see it exploding more with the increase of American bases and NATO expansion in more recent times.
yeah, yeah. No, it's definitely. There's something kind of what you might call Plutarchian about the interview, in the sense that, Plutarch would understand history by viewing
Oh, it's
these particular figures like Alcibiades, or in Athens, for example, like Alcibiades, or
Timophanes and Timoleon, the
yeah,
brother who had to kill his own brother to prevent him to become a tyrant, is one I think of as
yeah,
Plutarch's
yeah.
words.
So like, knowing Putin, because even if he's being treacherous or manipulative, like, you still get to know someone by experiencing their treachery. So it's like you still kind of
Yeah.
get to know
And
the thing.
treachery isn't necessarily a totally bad characteristic. Maybe it's like we were talking about before in realpolitik and running a country. Maybe it's to some degree a necessary evil. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like,
And the paranoia, I feel like Putin is kind of paranoiac. It's like he doesn't know. He's kind of like testing, like, is Tucker Carlson a CIA guy or isn't he? And like he's probing and trying to push him and stuff.
yeah, yeah. It was a bit peculiar.
And what can I learn from this exchange with him? What is he going to tell me about their strategies?
Well, like, there's one thing I did learn from that interview, which was that Russia doesn't know, and Putin, well, maybe not Russia, but Putin anyway, he doesn't know how to frame the actions of the invasion of Ukraine, because like, these things are never just one person's decision. Like, and it's like, oh, they may end up being, one person's decision, but the complex motivations and conditions which get to this point. And
Well,
well, I kind of thought that he doesn't know how to frame it. Like he keeps mixing between
Well, he didn't
secure.
want to say anything directly, but I kind of thought like maybe that's because he doesn't want to give away his full thinking process.
Yeah, well,
Like, because Tucker kind of pushed like, why on this exact date did you decide to start the special military operation or something
yeah,
like, and then Putin kind of went away from that. Maybe because he doesn't want to reveal the exact details, but Putin did say, listen, we kept asking you about NATO expansion, and then we realized we're not welcome in NATO, and it's not a personal thing, but we just realized, okay, we're not welcome, so this is what logically follows. We're not being welcome in NATO. We start doing this stuff, and then Victoria Nuland in 2014, at least according to the Jeffrey Sachs and Mersheimer version, and that phone call that's out there, kind of just said, okay, now we're going to do the coup. And according to Sachs, says this is happening all the time. So like, there's actually recently basically a coup and a soft coup in Pakistan where I think his name is Urman Khan, was like some famous rugby player who was fairly elected, and then they ousted him and gave him a 14-year jail sentence when he revealed some. The way I understand it from Jeffrey Sachs has the details maybe better in some article he wrote recently, but the way I understand it is this prime minister of Pakistan brought out a document which proved the CIA was ousting him, and then they said that's like a secret document of state that you are not allowed to divulge 14 years in prison. So it's like this. So that's the way it's. I mean, if you credit what Sachs saying, it's pretty bad. It's like, so you could see Putin didn't go into that kind of argument, but he could have given that kind of
yeah,
argument
yeah.
about.
You were talking to it like Carlson was talking to a man that probably had all this crazy knowledge and information that like no one in the West would ever have, because he's in the
Yeah,
position to have it, and like you're kind of looking at a man going, give us a little something, and he's probably being very cautious because he doesn't want to let the American intelligence agencies or whatever
it
government
occurs to
know
me
what he
just now
knows.
as we're
Yeah,
talking that Putin, he's really spent a lot of time studying in the last several years, studying the history of Ukraine and Russia, because he came
yeah.
out with an article like 6 months or something on the Kremlin website, like 6 months or something before the special military operation started. So he must have been like personally involved in a lot of research on this. So maybe maybe he just wants to talk about the thing that he's an expert on.
Well, like exactly, he's an expert on and that's what I was kind of hinting at earlier. I was thinking, why even do this? Because if Carlson is CIA, he might edit the footage and make you look like a crazy person, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's really
Yeah,
weird.
maybe.
It's really weird, and also it's in Russian, so it's like no one in the West is going to hear. It is going to verify that. Oh, what's he really saying? No one's going to care. So it's like and I suppose maybe he thought, well, they already hear
I guess
that I'm a
Carlson had
monster every
interviewed
day, so
Orban.
who cares?
Carlson had interviewed Orban like a couple months ago, didn't
Yeah,
he, or
true,
somebody?
true. He went to
So he
Hungary.
had
Yeah,
like some cred
yeah,
in terms of like these interviews
true. But
set up, like he stepped it up with.
I also think that it was just, as I was saying earlier, like this opportunity, and like because it was perhaps not even intentionally, but it was like, what, let's show everyone how much history knowledge I've actually studied, because Biden can't remember what happened 2 days ago. And how's that gonna, like the comparison is
I
just
noticed we're
it.
ramping that. See, in the public representation or existence, we're like ramping up this version that Biden is senile. It's been getting. I mean, the Republicans have been saying that for a long time, but now it's becoming like more the existing thing to which everybody has to respond to, and that's like
Mm.
the public thing.
Yeah, but it is true that like if you got Biden to talk about any kind of historical or philosophical or theological issue for more than 2 minutes, you'd just be embarrassed for him. Like, that is true.
Maybe I don't know. I mean, it's like people are a little harsh on Biden. I don't know. I think he gives some to me. He gives some pretty good answers on some things. I try to be. I think of when people don't like him. He's the political enemy. He's at war with doing all these wars. They don't like him. So then the natural tendency is to be very excessively critical. I try to like correct for that a little bit. I don't think Biden is. Uh, he's no worse than Trump anyway in
Yeah,
terms
but
of
like
his
I was
intellectual
gonna say,
capacity.
like I would say the same thing for Trump. I would say the same thing for Bush. I would say the same thing for Clinton. I would say the same thing for Blair. I would say the same thing for Merkel. I just can't imagine like
Yeah, I
listening
mean
to 2 hours of them speaking.
that's
I would just
why
turn it off. I'm
I
like, what the?
was like for a while I was trying to push not because I like his like progressive politics, but just because he's a more of a thinking person. I was pushing Cornel West because Cornel West was
Yeah.
trying to get in on the election, but now I've come to the conclusion that they're just the requirement to get the only interesting thing about Cornel West would be if he got on the debate stage like Ross Perot did years ago, where they had a outsider debating the two party candidates in the lead up to the election. But the requirements to get on the debate stage with Trump and Biden are so high. Cornel West would do very well on the debate stage with them, and I think he's a better presenter than they are, and he's just more knowledgeable. But I don't think it's going to happen. The reason I wanted like that sort of, I think, because I thought it was an avenue of invasion to where intelligence could get into the White House, and then you could. It doesn't have to be a progressive guy. To me, it could be as well somebody more like Dugin, in their opinions. But
Mm.
I mean, Dugin's not an American, so he can't run for president. But I want somebody just more thinking people to get in. But the political party system seems to obviate that. It seems to
Yeah.
totally exclude that possibility
Well, it's
for
this
whatever reason.
it's technocratic post-war, politics where these people are supposed to be savvy managerial types. Like they're not intellectuals, they're not poets, they're not orators, they're not people that are engaging in any way. And I think that worked because the whole kind of trauma of the first half of the 20th century, where you had people like the communist and
Well,
fascist.
Kennedy was very engaging, right? Kennedy was a very engaging
Yeah,
speaker, and that's after World War II. So I don't. It
true,
seems like it
true,
happened more. It's
true.
more recent.
Maybe it's more recent. Maybe it's like the 70s and 80s, like the kind of like technocratic.
And Nixon was a very intelligent. To me, Nixon was an
Yeah,
intelligent man. I'm not as so much in political, but I just think Nixon and Kissinger were steeped in intellectual theory, and they're talking about they read Spangler and things like that.
true, true. Yeah, you're right. It's probably more recent than just after World War II. But I was just saying that because there is this hangover from World War II, because you do have these visionaries in the 20th century, or first half 20th centuries, that have like they're good public speakers, they're engaging, and they're well read. They might be well versed in Marx, like Lenin was. They could be well versed in other
Political
intellectual.
movements that are based actually on ideas were big in the first half of the 20th
See,
century, right? Like, I mean,
yeah, yeah,
fascism, because it was a losing thing, we don't think about that. But recently, in this the media environment we're talking about now, like internet, you hear a lot more about the ideas behind fascism. That there was Giovanni Gentili was Hegelian, and
mm,
Mussolini and him got together and came up with the. Mussolini had been a communist, and then they came up with a theory of fascism, which is an intellectually dense and serious theory. So it's like this is idea-driven politics at that time, but we
mm.
don't have everything in America is just based on sort of there's a little bit of push and pull in the Constitution. In which way are people going to push it? That's the way it seems to me.
Yeah, like because
Although it's slightly philosophic because they have to go back to the founders who were in the 18th century to say anything.
okay, fair, but I definitely think that, yeah, like that's kind of what I was trying to hint at. It was like you have this early 20th century politics based off of ideas and visions of how, and like not just these stupid visions of world peace or something, but like visions which are grounded in history, in intellectual history of real philosophical and geopolitical thinking. And then
But
second
even
half of the
Kennedy's
20th
version
century.
of world peace was sensible because, like, what Kennedy said is you can't do what's been happening now, which is force the Pax Americana on powers that have nuclear weapons. It's just a straightforwardly sensible remark because the about, and he went into it a little bit because what happens is you get involved, and actually he said exactly what's happening now in Ukraine. They'll get involved in a protracted war, and then they'll never stop because they'll say, if we lose, we're going to use the nuclear weapons. So you can't defeat us at
Well,
any cost. And Kennedy just said, okay, we have to deal with that fact and try to negotiate peace within that situation,
yeah,
which I think was straightforward. It's not so crazy, and that's in a way, yeah, people like Jeffrey Sachs are trying to do that. I mean, that's the if I think like that's my polemic in a way with your position of being more. If I hear you as being more like on the, I don't know if it's fair to say, maybe tell me if you're more on the. I don't know if you listen to Mersheimer, but Mersheimer, who's so realpolitik, and then his foil seems to be Jeffrey Sachs, who says, listen, um, yeah, there's always this realpolitik version, but we can't settle with that because it's terrible. We have to try to be idealists in a way. We have to try to solve the problem. That's Sachs' kind of like response to the realpolitik view.
yeah, that's a good distinction, because as I was saying, like my problem with the late 20th century is that you have these, you know, experts and these practical, non-ideological, supposedly politicians who are like, we're just responding to situations and problems, but it's like, under what framework? Like you can't just respond. You have your response, to be kind of Heideggerian about it, your response is going to be driven by certain ideas that maybe you're not even aware of, or certain mechanisms you're not even aware of. And if you don't hash
Or
out
even Kant would say that. Kant says, you know, you're doing things for a purpose. They could be spelled out, but you're just not spelling them out to yourselves in a max. Maybe your maxim is the path of least possible resistance, but you have something that you could spell out to yourself if you step back a little bit in this stasis and stood back and see what you're doing.
And I actually think that there's wiggle room now, because we've had a certain amount of, like, you know, this kind of you know, these kind of practical, non-ideological experts who just respond to problems, and they're innovative and adaptive. We've had this period of them from, I would say, you know, obviously it was less extreme with people like with Kennedy, but like, you know, later on it did get very technocratic and so-called practical. And now it's like, okay, well, we need like coherence, right? We need to actually ground our vision and our kind of political destiny, if we can call it that, which is a pretty dramatic word, but
the destiny of the globe. Yeah, I mean the destiny of the world,
in
basically.
something, basically.
Yeah.
And actually, one thing Putin brought up in the interview was that and I actually wish Carlson didn't spend so much time talking about the Ukraine conflict, because I got the impression that basically Putin wasn't really going to say too much, because for tactical reasons or whatever, for not giving away, blah blah. But he asked them, "What do you think of AI? Like, is AI going to take over?" And then Putin kind of laughed, but then he was like, "No, but biotechnics is a serious issue. I mean, like, people are already designing biotech." And I was like, see, he's like, this is remarkable. He's someone who's actually thinking about these issues, like, and these issues aren't just like, you know, he's thinking about the issues of biotech as a threat to humanity, not just as a problem for like his administration in Russia in the short term, like humanity. And I think that's something which politicians have lost the capacity to do, to think of these problems and frame them like in the sense of, what does this mean for humanity, or something more,
Maybe,
you
yeah,
know.
maybe partially because Putin and Xi are such long-term leaders, whereas the American system, the Republicans and Democrats claim that they're creating transparency by each one, the Republicans showing the evils of the Democrats showing evils of the Republicans, and that they are in this hot, you know, somebody said, some British guy said around 1800 or something, there's a book like the, uh, called like the American Commonwealth or something like that. He said, he quoted somebody to say, America is based on Calvin and Hobbes, like the title of the comic strip. And Hobbes is so big on like paranoia about the abuses of government that it ruins it makes the American system totally allergic to what they constantly denounce as authoritarian rule of somebody like Xi or Putin. But then we lose the whole advantage of somebody that's there for a long time and can really
Mm,
get an inductive basis for their action and study things.
that's true. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, it's possible that the kind of temporal limitations to the democratic rule have stopped that, like stopped in being able to ground, the kind of immediate political concerns of their country with
And there's a lot of people that
bigger
have the
picture
sense
stuff.
that this is the idea of the swamp or the deep state or the bureaucratic state or etc. And maybe Putin shares this view that the people that are really running the show are the intelligence agencies in their skiffs or whatever, in their sensitive compartmented information facilities, like these metal boxes where nobody can hear them talking. These are the real people, are the permanent intelligence community and bureaucracy. And maybe that's what Putin thinks. Like, so the CIA is really running things because the two parties are only there for a short time, and sometimes they even have CIA people as their candidate, like Bush Senior, and maybe other the conspiracy people say other people also, Obama,
Mm.
Clinton, etc. Those are alleged things, but the idea being the only people that are they're permanently there are kind of these beltway people and the intelligence people, and their strategy is more like what Dugan is always talking about, the geopolitical strategy of uh, what's the guy's name, Brzezinski,
Zygmunt Brzezinski.
Zelensky or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever his name is, and the grand chessboard or whatever his thing is. And I think he predicted that the Ukraine was going to be one of the shatter points on the Eurasian frontier or whatever. And just like as Mersheimer did, and I think Huntington also did after in his response to Fukuyama and the Clash of Civilizations. And that was a known strategy, that this is like the point where we have to make an incursion into and start the balkanization of Russia. And so,
Well, that's an interesting point, because that kind of fits the private public distinction, in the sense that you have people like Putin or Xi, who the long-term entrenched power, it's not democratic and so on, but it's at least public. Whereas the long-term entrenched power in the US, for example, if you're talking about the deep state and the intelligence agencies or the military industrial complex or the corporate interest or whatever it is, that's private. Like we don't know their names. Like we don't know who they are. We don't address them as we don't coherently
I
address them
mean,
as a
we
kind of
know certain
personified
people,
powers.
like we hear of Robert Kagan and Victoria Nuland and certain
Yeah.
power players, and we know like there's like the Atlantic Council is constantly coming out with propaganda about how we have to um, maintain full spectrum dominance of the globe and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, in a certain way, we don't know some conversations, like for instance, that whole thing about the unidentified aerial phenomena thing, uh, which I want to say, my prudential view is what they're talking about is Chinese drones, but a lot of people think what they're saying in those skiffs is actually, this is like some kind of CIA skunk works, or the conspiracy theory people, like people that there's this podcast, the Dark Journalist or something. People of that bent think it's aliens, but I think it's like there's so many, and these are people that are, some of them are politically active and kind of exercise some power. So there's a lot of higgledy-piggledy forces at work here in American politics.
Yeah, true. So okay, to move on to another topic that I wanted to touch on here was the kind of power knowledge uh relationship, basically, because I think the public intellectual, or we touched on the philosophy king idea the last time, is very much based on a kind of claim to authority based off of a superior knowledge to other people, right? And like I'm not sure what you think about this, but I tend to be sympathetic of the philosophy king idea. I'm which is kind of like the public intellectual mixed with the power aspect. So um a lot of people that I'm friends with, or people that I know in kind of alternative intellectual circles, I get the impression that most people are sort of suspicious of the philosophy king, that like it's a kind of nice archetypal image, but they wouldn't really take
Well,
the
there's like a
actual thing
grand,
too seriously, but like
I
I'm
think
actually
in the
genuinely like,
represented
you know,
public thing, there's such a ire against authoritarianism, and there's such a fear for democracy. But is you never know what the hell we're talking about when we say democracy. Does it mean the
yeah.
vote? Because I think the vote is totally meaningless. It's like, what are we voting for? Either Biden or Trump. It's meaningless. We're giving it a menu, and then we're pretending that we're participating.
Yeah.
This is not for the preservative of all of our other rights, as our Supreme Court, our illustrious Supreme Court Justice Roberts told us during his confirmation hearing. It's just like it's not adequate concept of democracy. But then, so there's what I'm saying is, anytime we have a discussion like this, we have to confront, if we're in public like Putin is, and he's talking to the people and stuff, we have to confront and respond to what exists publicly, to the public talk. Whereas the other side, like Heidegger in his Latour seminars with Agamben, he said, let's withdraw from publicness. This is, actually, I wrote down this little statement.
Okay.
At the end of it, he said, this is a very small statement. What remains essential is to continue along the same path without concern for the publicness around us. So to Heidegger, like, the philosopher has to concern themselves with the matter itself, self saka, and there's no other authority. And one other authority could be the public rattling of discussion, where you have to respond to, whatever Jordan Peterson is thinking
Okay.
about,
Yeah.
whatever what's that guy, that comedian, Joe Rogan is talking about, or whatever.
Yeah, this is the awful aspect of the internet, is that you're constantly demanded. And I thought, like, I'm somewhat an example of this problem, where it's like you feel compelled to respond to everything the whole time, because if you don't respond to anything, you do miss out on important stuff. But there's no kind of,
And it's also, sorry,
I was just gonna say, there's no immediate way to know until you sort of engage with it a little bit, and then you kind of go, this is just bullshit, go away. Or like the Taylor Swift stuff recently, I was just okay, no, go away. But like, there's this like, if you want to be a public intellectual today, even if you're just doing it like we're doing it in just like a small kind of niche circle of the internet, small tiny circle of the internet, which most 99.99999% of people have no idea it even exists. But it's like you do unfortunately
we're
feel,
still talking about a lot of things that are a public moment, and that a lot of
yeah.
people, that millions are talking about. And Leo Strauss said, as a political philosopher, he thought that it's a responsibility of the profession to address these kind of things. And he got, right after World War II, the origin of this notion of the conspiracy theory, this very phrase, conspiracy theory, became popular. Conspiracy theory version of life, which Zizek calls the poor man's ideology. This was mentioned in Karl Popper's book on the Open Society and Its Enemies, and it became popular in like academic circles, and is mentioned, I think, by Susan Sontag in one of her seminars, where she's heard vocally on talking to Leo Strauss. And what Strauss said is, like, Popper's version of Plato is totally illiterate, and it just doesn't meet the standards of classical philology or classical scholarship. And he got Eric Vogelin to make some statements, and Popper was refused employment. Eric Vogelin came out and gave his recommendation to the staff of University of Chicago, and then University of Chicago refused employment to Popper because it was so incompetent. But the book was so popular politically and on the market that still to this day, people take it as a very serious work, and Dugan studies it, and Dugan likes it because he thinks it's like, here's the Soros version of liberalism in its purest form, Karl Popper's Open Society, and this is my enemy, and I'll study it very closely. And Popper hates Hegel, so I'm going to, promote Hegel. Dugan's been promoting Hegel a lot lately. But it's like the book is substandard from the point of view of the highest classical scholarship, and people like Strauss and Heidegger. So Heidegger can have total contempt for that, because he's ignoring publicness. But Strauss thinks, okay, it's my duty as a political philosopher to, address the things that the public talk is about. What's all the talk about? Proper and open society. We have to address this as political scientists, and you have to waste all this time on whatever Jordan Peterson or whatever the popular thing is.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, like this is one of the um uh, uh dangers of conceiving of the public intellectual within the internet era is just that as I was saying before, like there's just no filter. There's no way to really know what's important and what's not. It's a kind of chaotic stream of just information being pushed your way
The word
24/7.
intellect is like very simple in the Greek. It's just like, I think just the basic etymology you can get on Wikipedia is enough. It's just like it's like interlegere, which is like uh, reading a distinction, making a distinction. It's just distinguishing. The intellect or nous is just a distinguishing power. Has a very simple
Mm.
idea, but it doesn't give us that much guidance on like what are we looking for. Like where is the point where somebody's and public intellectual, and where are they just like a media star? So like, I forget what this guy's the guy that's the most popular guy on YouTube is like, he's got like tenfold the audience of Jordan Peterson, and he does some stupid videos about burying himself or something. I forget what his name is, but it's like,
Is it
why
is
isn't
it
he?
is it PewDiePie?
Uh,
I
maybe
don't
I
know.
can't
Yeah,
remember.
someone is.
I think
Yeah.
QTPie has more. Yeah, QTPie also has a big audience. I think there's like some other guy, but it's like, yeah, why aren't those guys public intellectuals? It's the Peterson tells us popularity is the sign of good science. Like he says, oh,
Yeah.
if papers are most cited, that's usually a good sign that they're the best science. And it's like he thinks, oh, if I'm getting a large audience on YouTube, I must have higher quality. But I think it's the Karl Popper case is the watershed case. It's like this is a dense book, but it's bad scholarship. But then you get things that are just horrible. It's like there's a declining, um, like Peterson. It's like he still thinks that Marx was against property, which is ridiculous because Marx was for people getting the right amount of pay for their work instead of being exploited. Marx was against some term of art of his of private property as a special qualified form of property, which he was against because he considers some manipulation, but he was for a personal property. But it's like Peterson has been going on for 30 years without even knowing the most basic things about the subjects he's supposedly informing the public about. It's
Mm.
horrible. So it's like,
Yeah.
where's the line where we're talking about a public intellectual and we're just talking about somebody who has a big audience and is popular?
Mm.
I think
Yeah.
that's the one issue.
Yeah. No, that's definitely a huge issue. Um. Yeah, but I suppose I'm torn between, like, I've recently done this course on Vrilio, so it's like I'm completely aware of like all the terrible things about this communication technology, but like there's these other issues, for example, like biotech, the birth gap demographic issues, the potential, the big geopolitical issues, and all these other things, which you just don't have like the institutional players even thinking about them, so it kind of necessitates this, I suppose, similar to what we were saying earlier, this emergence of the public. It kind of necessitates this other domain of people like us, for example, to respond to this stuff, because this is not,
Well,
COVID
there
was a good,
is like
good
an
example of that.
emergency in the sense that like the legal and the juridical sphere, the lawyers and the jurists and the politicians who are lawmakers can't keep up with every technical field. So there's a escape,
Mm,
the problem of the expert, and the experts, and they all they can do is claim to be good evaluators of expert advice and testimony. But yeah, obviously, like you said, the Varela is talking about some subjects that are of very large importance, and in a way, they cloud the whole political process. The fact that these technological experts are in advance of the knowledge of any political actors and jurists.
Yeah, you're right. There's this complete gap now. The technological advancement is just it's just surpassed the institutional regulations, and not just the practical regulations, but even the awareness of the problems. They don't even have an awareness of the problems. So it's like, okay, well, who's going to respond to that? Who's going to be a kind of
That's what I'm
embodiment
saying.
of
Who's
that
going to make
awareness?
these things represented and become an existing thing in the public? That's what
Mm,
it is. They start, things only exist once you're talking about them, and then like Agamben is making this point that in all our legal systems, we don't recognize the press as part of the constituting power of the government, as part like
yeah.
a constitution. But it's playing this constituting power, and he was especially aware of it because Berlusconi was a big press mogul and also the prime minister. But it's happening everywhere, um, and it's not recognized by the. It's like in America, you can't recognize that because we only can point to the Constitution, which didn't. There's no like there's Article 1, 2, and 3 on the, but there's not a section on the judiciary and on the Congress, on the executive, and on the judiciary. But there's not a section on. There's just like a few words about like Second Amendment or whatever about the freedom of the press, but it's not considered a branch of government. It's not, even though, yeah, in effect, it's overpowering the government since like 1800 even.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, if you take the COVID stuff as an example, it was like, there's absolutely no, for example, workers that were being subjected to take the vaccine or lose their job. There was absolutely no mechanism to negotiate around that or like create any sort of pushback against that. It was just pure,
I
like,
guess that's the
you know,
same phenomena people are thinking of with Trump in this current. They've got this case in the Supreme Court right now about whether Trump is can be excluded from the ballot in Colorado and I think it's some other state in Maine or something. But the point that I think it was Robert Kagan came out with an article and he said like what you guys don't recognize is you can hem and haw about this, but it's happening. It's like Trump is gonna. There's no mechanism to kind of stop these things, even though yeah, there's a court case, but it's like Trump's followers still are. They have the will to vote for him, and it's still gonna. The election's still gonna happen, and so on. And these things are just like out of our hands in a way. I think maybe like this idea of Putin of the CIA is due to the fact that Putin realizes that there's kind of a self-inoculation of government against these factors of the craziness of the media environment, where they've just seized authority, which is in some way independent, like the Snowden revelations and so on. They've seized some authority, which is independent of the madness of these discussions, in order to maintain order of some crude kind and pursue their agendas, which generally I think are not corrupt agendas in the sense of personal gain. They're not mainly interested in personal gain, but they're interested in dominating the world for America.
So,
and that's something the public can't. The public, we just talk about it, but we can't really influence it. We don't have an influence it that much maybe because foreign policy is so out of our hands. So there's such a free hand in foreign policy.
and just to bring it back to the question of kind of power and knowledge, because what's happening now, okay, is like, so basically you have the institutions, kind of bourgeois institutions. You have the surpassing of these institutions beyond their regulation and even coherency, which is kind of a part of my critique of the Western politicians not being coherent or not being able to sit down and discuss issues for 2 hours, because they're expressions of these well, kind of bourgeois, but also kind of post-war technocratic bourgeois managerial political figures. And it's like, as you were saying, like the media, the technology, the culture, everything has just surpassed them so quickly that like it's not even always a personal critique, although it's somewhat of a personal critique, but it's also just the fact that if you put them down to speak about anything for 2 hours, they just like, you know what I mean? Like it's like the world has just surpassed them. They
Well, I
don't they
mean,
don't
that
know what
was
they're
already
talking
true.
about
I mean,
anymore.
Socrates already recognized that in ancient Athens, like Pericles or whoever, you could
Mm.
ask him about something, but once you start to probe, he wouldn't know what to say. I mean, that's always true of practical people to some extent because they don't have time to. Maybe a lot of because I don't know why because maybe usually you don't get the combination of a practical person and a sort of a hermeneutic type of person.
Well, I think you could like I think there are examples of that, and like that is the ideal statesman, right? I mean, I think it's some sort of a mediation of
Yeah,
those two
I
things.
mean Socrates in a way is like that, but he was never actually a head of state, and Plato did. Plato, they like to say, "Oh, Trump ran businesses or whatever," even though he mostly
Yeah.
took a loss on them, I think. But anyway, um, yeah, Plato did found the academy, did found the university. So in a way, all our universities stem from the Platonic Socratic Academy, and so in a way, they were um, leaders of something and pilots of the ship of something, but just not of the academy doesn't have a military.
Well, yeah, yeah. So it'd be funny if it did, but it'd be like, yeah, that would be quite an event. But so so actually, I was thinking there as you said that of like trying to instill the practical people with some sort of better philosophic practice. I was thinking of
Well,
Alcibiades
that's
because
constantly happening. Yeah, I mean that's constantly happening in some way, but it doesn't take. It's like we heard this constant in America. You always hear, "Oh, there's a down swing on civic education. Basic civics courses aren't taught anymore." Blah blah blah. But it's like, well, they are, but like people don't care because going into business and they're trying to win elections and they're like all kinds of things are happening. Do you think Trump cares that much about civics? It's like
yeah. Well,
it
you see,
doesn't help that much to. They already exist. There's civic courses. You could take them if you want.
well, so like yes, so this is the problem. Is like, because I was going to say that. So if you go back to um Socrates and Alcibiades, like Alcibiades was this kind of very active youth who was very kind of passionate and very motivated, very ambitious. And like you see within that dialogue, Socrates tried to sort of not make him unambitious, but like to kind of supplement that ambition with a thoughtfulness. So you see
Right, and
the
also with
fusion.
Aristotle and Alexander, I suppose is a
Yes,
good
exactly.
example.
Yeah, totally. And which sort of pushes us back into this idea of like, okay, like we know politicians have to deal with practical situations, and like we know they can't just do what they want, and they can't just have these abstract ideals to go by. But the late 20th century really has done a bad job of trying to harmonize
Well, I mean, I
the
think that
practical
the
and the
issue, I
philosophical.
think that already the conclusion Socrates came to is you have to start with early education, and this is
Yeah.
shown in the Nomoi or Gawaz, where the musical education, which makes people human beings, harmonizes them, is the first education, and that corresponds to the performances in the plays where these playwrights are actually writing the music and composing the dance, and not just the dialogue. But the point is you'd have to start. The point is we have an education system of bourgeois, which is geared towards the professions, which is basically something terribly corrupt because it's against eudaimonia, because what it is saying everybody should be subordinated to somebody like a business or like a managerial elite who's they're just getting a wage, but they're not working for themselves. We have an idea which is defunct, which is still alive, which is like still with Jefferson and with as late as the Civil War with Lincoln. Lincoln said it would be a very strange misfortune if somebody should not come into possession of their own like homestead and work for the labor for the mix. The Locke talks about. Locke says
Mm.
every value of human beings are due to mixing our labor with the soil or something like that against the ancients who thought organization was the main thing. But the point is, up until Lincoln, it was still the case that people could work for themselves, have a small homestead, make be independent from their sale of their crops or whatever, or be like small grocer or something else. And then there was a few people, like all the founders were like businessmen, but they weren't intending to employ large numbers of people and be the boss of large numbers of people, which is the big problem we have now. And then we carry over the word work, which used to mean labor still up to Lincoln, to mean wage slavery, to mean working for somebody else. Like if you look at this movie, Devil and Daniel Webster from 1930s, which is a little bit in Zizek's sense, kitsch, because it shows this old value, which is the devil is the one who first gets the idea of getting people to work for you instead of doing your own labor on the farm. And once you get like some guys like that in charge of Bezos or whatever, then you obviate the possibility of a happy life because everybody's a wage worker and they're not even doing labor; they're doing whatever the owner who's controlled all these people wants them to do. And then there's like in our own time the question of, do these business people like Musk and whatever have more power, or does Biden and the government have more power? I mean, there's this war between these interests, and it's a situation where it's our ideas coming out of the 18th century and 19th century were totally had no sight of. So they're inappropriate ideas, but they're still in play.
Yeah.
And they still the things that exist and people talk about.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, and like the frustrating thing about people like Musk is like we're so stuck in this framework of thinking that you were talking about, because you have this worship of people like Musk as if Musk is going to save us from whatever, from the horror of whatever, like a progressive technocracy or whatever. And it's like we don't need more technological and industry leaders. We need social and political leaders and intellectual leaders. Like that's what we actually have like a real demand, like need for, and you just keep getting these kind of sycophantic
I guess one of
drives for
the big
technology.
factors that I found a good expression for in when I was reading Habermas is what Locke said, and it's I think it's gets underplayed in current discussions. I wrote down the statement if I can find it. Whoever, this is what Locke said, so Locke proposed a strategy of the pride of reason should fight against the pride of mores, and that reason could eventually, so we're talking about a little before 1800, Locke is proposing this, and Locke is often cited as like the model for liberalism. But he says, whoever judges mores judges honor, and whoever judges honor derives his law from opinion. So I think of like here, I don't know if you've seen those, they're kind of ubiquitous. You probably know about the Fast and Furious movies, which a lot of them hang on like, here's this working class mores and working class honor, and like people that drink Pabst Blue Ribbon and who don't like Belgian beer or whatever, and who are against like organic coffee or whatever, and who like whatever working class people have supposedly like. And there's this war of irrational mores. So they just have their way of life, and it's not a matter of reasoning it, of giving a rationalization of it. It's just they're defending their niche of their way of life. And then there's this fight of people that are rationalizing and saying, well, does what you're doing really make sense? And what it would be better if you do it this way? And isn't this more reasonable? And that's a big thing with since the Enlightenment, of this war between little niches of mores that are people pride themselves on and think I'm superior because I'm a part of the working class, and then other people saying, but that doesn't really make sense, and et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so you have like, yeah, so you again, it's the people that are just they have a sense of pride in their way of life or their practice, and then these other people who have this
and it's adamant. It's like it's not. They're not reasoning. They're just this is my way of life, and they don't even say it that way. They just have feel pride about how they're living or whatever. And then and like Bertrand Russell wrote his Bertrand Russell wrote something like on in defense of leisure or something like that because he's showing like how the whole idea of the working culture is kind of poisonous because it creates a
Mm.
situation where all kinds of like I call it like Imelda Marcos effect. There's a rich person, they want 20,000 pairs of shoes. All the labor is wasted. It's just because of whim. And why are we misdirecting so much human life towards just the whims of rich people?
Yeah. It comes back to the same thing we were talking about earlier with the complete thoughtlessness of this life of kind of just activity for activity's sake. Completely ungrounded in anything particularly. And like,
And also just this
I was just gonna say, and like this,
and
this
forces
is
working in different directions that are like causing stumbling and then clouding the situation.
yeah, true. Um, so just to frame, we've been talking for about an hour and a half or more than that. I think maybe 2 hours, and so which is the same length as the Putin interview. So just to kind of frame the historical context, because I did want to touch upon the kind of the question of power and knowledge, because you have this kind of thoughtless, mindless system, and you have these elites, kind of managerial elites, and you have the kind of post-war technocratic order, and it's all like the more time that goes on, the more kind of thoughtless they are, and then you have at the same time all these really big issues, which are not just particular issues for this group or that group, but like
Thoughtless or maybe
issues.
impotent, maybe unable to do anything to do that, right?
Yeah. Well, I would say both, but like uh, suddenly you have an emergence of all these crises and catastrophes, and like not just for this particular group or that particular group, but like catastrophes which are ontological, theological, and so on, like biotechnics and nuclear weapon, AI, all these major problems, and you suddenly have this need for actually framing and thinking and coherently parceling out what's going on, and creating a kind of coherent vision based off of, maybe not utopianism in the sense of the early 20th century, but something at least that's a lot different from the kind of mindless, practical, technocratic disposition of the late 20th century. So you have this emergence then of people who are thinking again, and it, the question which I heard someone bring up recently, I can't remember exactly who it was, but was that once you start to engage, for example, philosophically, or you frame things historically or theologically or anything like that, there is an inevitable power claim that's going to come from that, because you are thinking like, well, I actually understand the situation, and I actually can kind of parcel out a vision to move forward. So why the fuck are you people in charge? So it's like there's also, I think, a kind of
Well, it's
liberal.
interesting because Heidegger seems to think that he has more. Heidegger thinks he has more insight and he's thought more thoroughly through these things, but he doesn't have this attitude of, yeah, that's the thing why Heidegger. He tried. That's to me the explanation of why Heidegger tried to join the Nazi movement early on in like 1933, right at the beginning,
Hmm.
is because just what you're saying. But generally, he doesn't ever say like, "Oh, but why don't I have more power?" He just says, "Let's withdraw from publicness and carry on our thing." So that's kind of mysterious there. And so it's like if we're bringing this to an end a little bit, I'd say like one thing, like everything we said in this discussion could be, we could superimpose another level on it, which would be like a Heideggerian Straussian um, version of how our current ideas came into power through the end of the religious end of the Catholic version, where the soul is set against the body and things like that, to the current version where we have all of the time talk about subjectivity and objectivity, which is the post-Cartesian way of talking. And this kind of talk about truth and getting into where Nietzsche comes in and that kind of thing could be superimposed totally over all the topics that we touched on in this discussion, and that would be bring an extra level of that would bring the true to me that would bring the real thoughtful uh, that would make it like a special philosophic approach to the matters themselves rather than a discussion which is controlled by the currently existing representation of discussion about these kind of things that everybody already knows about.
Yeah, fair enough. Although I did think the private public distinction was good because and all because I do think the private public and the
That's an example of something that we got from from history that's coming into us, but also there's other things about truth, what counts as truth and knowledge are coming to us historically too, and we can learn more about that.
Yeah, definitely. Because the private public thing I think mapped onto the practice theory divide as well. Because they're just something a kind of overly private understanding of life.
Let me
I
just
think
say
does
one thing
lead to
about
a
that.
thoughtlessness. And then a public, I think as you were saying, the emergence of the public in the Greek sense was also a kind of representation practice. And then it's like, okay, well, what's actually happening? How are we going to represent this? And like then it
And I
feeds
think
back
that's
into
kind of like
thought.
what
Yeah.
Heidegger means by the beginning of history, and that history could stop. Heidegger makes some comments about in his black notebooks about like history stopping, but that it could restart again. It's a little bit ambiguous, but I think part of what he means is the Greeks become a historical people because they start, representing and making to exist these discussions.
Yes, they bring forth a certain self-consciousness which is in a sense reflective, and then that sort of does something, and then and then the end of history does seem to be
I think what they think is that America is the end of, Kochev said America is the end of history, and what they think is that Americans have no philosophic sense. That's what and it's basically true. So like the Germans, like
pragmatism.
Hegel was in the center of things. The state had supervision over the education system. Hegel was informing. Listen, you guys are going to go out and become ministers of state, and you're going to run things. You need to know my teaching. Prussia was the philosophic state, and Hannah Arendt in her letter to Jasper said, "I don't know what's more difficult." Like in the '50s, she said, "I don't know what's more difficult to give even an inkling of the sense of what politics is to the German, was totally absorbed in this old, like dense Teutonic sense of the medieval scholastics and the German idealist philosophers, and respects that and takes it really seriously, or to give even an inkling of a sense of what philosophy is to the Americans who are absorbed in their politics."
Okay, yeah. That's another good distinction. Yeah, like practice and theory distinction, or like reflection and action. Because again, like the Greeks seem to be emerge as an attempt to synthesize, excuse me, the two, I think.
Well, yeah, Socrates is like that too, but there's also in the Greeks, at the highest point, Sophia is just the pure onlooking, right? It's a glancing right at the idea, at the form or the universal. So there's an element of that wisdom is passive. It's passive gazing. I think even in Socrates, but especially in Aristotle. Whereas the modern thing is usually represented as Kant says, "Oh no, but we're playing an active role and we're in a way legislating the laws of nature to ourselves because we're the subject rather than an animal walking around with eyes, with the senses." But that's all complicated stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll leave it there.
But I
Then for
agree with
now.
you. It's like Socrates tries to harmonize, the body and the insights
Yeah.
at some level.
Cool. Well, okay. So we'll leave it there for now anyway, and we'll get into the other stuff maybe in a later date. So
Okay, let me just say make one last point because I've
Okay.
tried to bring a awareness of this. Is what the Prussians mean and what Strauss means a lot by philosophy is asking what concepts we see the world through. And I think a good example is just the racism example, which is that the term race and racism, because the Catholics used to use race to mean things like the race of the deaf, the race of the deaf, the genus of the deaf is a permanent thing existing all the time. But the idea of racism became popularized through an attempt to explain what the Nazis were doing during World War II, and it became popular first in universities, and then in the 1960s, everybody started talking about racism. But that's a concept which we can then see anything through.
Mm.
Foucault says like any investigation we're doing is like a shadow cast from the present out of the present, and we call that looking at the past. But we take our concept of racism, and then we could see racism in ancient Athens. We could see racism anywhere, but it actually only arose as a concept by which we consciously understand things and how do they call it in the law? Not a causal factor, but um, uh, it's a structural factor. It becomes a structural factor in human life to understand things through those concepts. But that's all I wanted to say. Okay, so that's a great conversation. So